And then somewhere along the line, before I got there, somebody wanted a tail dragger, and I believe it was an Aranca, but I could be mistaken, because that was also gone by the time I got there. And that didn't work out, and although it was the person who owned it, was leasing it to the club, and he and a couple other people, the only ones that ever flew it, and they didn't fly it much at that. So that was on the fleet, and I can't think of the name of the other gentleman. I can see him in my mind, but he had a Cherokee 140, one of the original late 60s, first off the line Hershey bar 140 horsepower Cherokees, and that one stuck. So that was still there well into the 70s, probably the late 70s, and the club ended up buying that from him later on. And then there were some other clubs associated with other airplanes associated with the club. The treasurer of the club, Jay Levinson, had a Grumman Tiger, and he flew it a lot and would take club members up in it, but he never brought himself to have his pride and joy be on the club line and have other people fly it all the time. So when I got there, Don had sold his 172 and was phasing out of the club. He ended up changing careers, became a Methodist minister, and not so much involved in flying after a while, but he's a great supporter of the club. And he came out when we were building our hangar down there in Sanford, and that was whatever it was, only 20 years ago, and was still supporting the club. As a good man. So that was replaced with an airplane that was bought by the club. And so also a trainer was needed, and a guy named Ernie Moline had a 152 that he brought to the club. But the club, their first real purchase of a fleet was two 152s. I believe just before I got there. I think that was probably in 1967, two used 152s. So the fleet when I arrived was a one Warrior, an old Warrior, one Skyhawk, I think was a 62 or 63 Skyhawk. It had the Continental engine, hadn't gone to Lycoming yet, and two 152s with Continental 0200 engines. And my impression was then, and certainly shortly after then, when we talked about a fleet from time to time, that was just happenstance and what happened. I mean, that there was no fleet committee. It was a pretty informal club. The board was pretty loosey-goosey. But what really happened, and to spur that on, is that in 1969, we had just a banner year that just went absolutely nuts. It was very, very busy, flying like crazy. And we had, I think, at least a few more. We had 5 150s on the line, a couple of Skyhawks, and a couple of Warriors, and we were just flying the heck out of the training airplanes. I like to tell the story that when I found out, I was just flabbergasted myself that the 152 fleet were each flying over 100 hours a month. In those months, it was just land take off. The weather was good, and this led to a big crash in 1970, where the economy turned and it all turned around. But and I'll say that we struggled over the years with fleet issues. I pushed the idea of a fleet committee, but it never was a good committee. People were, as George said, were sitting around talking about what they dream of having, or they'd poll a few club members, or we'd do a poll in the club. And we ended up buying some airplanes that we thought were in demand, and then found out they weren't. And two examples being a Cessna 182 and a Cherokee 6, both clamoring for people who thought we just absolutely had to have those airplanes. Then they just sat on the ground and flew on holidays, and that was about it. And so I will say that the fleet committees that we've had recently, and especially the one that John and Ken were on recently, have finally done what a fleet committee should do, and actually did serious research and did some other things that finally I think have confirmed where we are. And the old argument was, and I'll stop here now, are we primarily for training and low-end flying for people who aren't wealthy, or who are for that matter, who want to be in this kind of a club and the kind of camaraderie we have? Or do we succumb to the pressure of those who come to the club and want and argue for a bonanza, or, you know, a high-end airplane, and they're sure that that would attract, the argument always is this would attract others from outside. And then the other side of that is we have a formula that's worked for, you know, for now for about 60 years, but, you know, in those times for 30, 40 years, we know it works. There's a demand for this. And it's kind of scary to go out and throw huge money at very fancy airplanes. So that's basically been the argument, and it's changed slowly. I mean, we now have Moonies, which have been marginally successful, not as much as we wanted, but they do serve in a good niche there. So that's the history of it. There's a lot of colorful stories of interesting board meetings and people yelling at each other, but I'll just stop there and listen, because this should be interesting.
Yeah, John, we'll get to the yelling in just a minute. Yeah, it's the age-old question. Do you try to produce a fleet to serve the members you have, or do you produce a fleet to attract the members you want? And I'm going to let John, Ken, and Mike talk about that. Most of you know that John is a past president of the club, and a longtime member who's now lives elsewhere, but still stays very involved and keeps up with the club, and lets us know his thoughts pretty frequently. And Michael, you know, is on the current board, and Ken Williams, longtime club member, still keeps track of our flight hours. And it's pretty interesting because I was looking earlier at a lot of the data on flight hours back in 17. And now we have Ken here to kind of give us a sense of how those flight hours in 2017 and the years previous to that stack up with where we have been more recently. So, John, please.
Well, thank you. Got to give credit to Graham for appointing the fleet committee. When I was president, I had tried to encourage a group to start it, and I'd also said I wanted to continue to be involved when Graham took over following me. And he said, well, if you're serious about it, I'd like you to chair a fleet committee. And I kind of said, well, I didn't mean that, but I got the assignment anyway. I thought I would convince the club to buy my dream aircraft, which I'll never be able to fly and never be able to afford. But just for the record, I flew on a friend's TBM 850 and loved it, which I'll take over Georgia's King Air any day. But we jumped into the committee and we tried to be disciplined about looking at the data, looking at club opinions, and figuring out where we wanted to go. For those of you who are not on the board, at least while I was there, I was on the board for, I think, something like 10 years. About once a year, we would get opportunistic leasing opportunities. Somebody would come to us with a Cherokee 6 and say they would lease it to the club on real good terms, because what they really wanted to do was fly it themselves and get the club to use it a little bit to take care of some of the expenses. It never has worked out for the club historically, as John pointed out, with some of those. And over time, the board developed the attitude, while I was there at least, that we would decide on what we wanted in our fleet, and then we would figure out the best way to obtain it and finance it and run it. And if opportunistic leases came along, as long as it was within our strategic plan, we would look to them, but otherwise not. You can't always believe survey data. When John Hunter decided he was going to sell my favorite plane with the club, 26 Mike. Then Lloyd decided that he was going to sell 60 Romeo. The club decided to buy 60 Romeo, keep 68 X-ray, and we did get very favorable terms from Lloyd on the lease of 3 Delta Romeo. But again, it was one of those situations where John and George both told me it's never going to work. And they were right. I was wrong. Fortunately, it wasn't a financial issue for the club because of the terms, but the effort to being current in that plane and then only use it a few hours a year turned out not to be worth it. So what did the fleet committee decide it wanted to do, and how did it approach its tasks? By the way, I'll mention to everybody online that I posted a copy, because it phases off over time. I posted a copy of the fleet committee report on my FBO news items, where it'll remain for another 4 days before it'll time off again. But I posted it there in case anybody wanted to was inspired to refer to it during the course of this meeting. Largely at Michael's suggestion, we broke the club down into the personae that we thought we were serving. We certainly had many inactive pilots in the club. We have members, we have primary students, we have career-oriented students, we have occasional pleasure flyers, and we have travelers. And they have different needs, and we were trying to address those with the work while being faithful to the club. You hold the mission statement up there a second, George. I think that's what I was going to talk about, that we wanted to create a vision for the fleet, not what we were going to do tomorrow or the next day, but what we're going to do over the next 5 to 10 years, and then have a plan to take actionable steps in the interim to move in that direction. We looked at who, as I said, we looked at the various persona who were members of the club that we were serving. We wanted to look at the risks. We wanted to try to validate what we were doing with surveys. We held a town hall meeting, but we wanted to maintain the culture of the club and the mission to provide safe training, low-cost education, inexpensive hourly rates, and flying fun. I'm not going to go through all the methodology and details of the report because that would take a long time. We did look at the data. We did do a member survey on what people were interested in. You have to be cautious about surveys. If you believe the survey we did before we got into 3 Delta Romeo, it would have implied the plane would have been flying about, if I recall, I didn't go back, get around to looking this up, but probably close to 50 hours a month. I don't think it ever exceeded 15 hours a month. So those things have to be taken with a grain of salt. We did look at dividing the aircraft alternatives into the basic fleet, the mid-range fleet, and the advanced fleet. I think there's a role for all of them in the club. The Mooney hours have been down recently. That's partly due, I think, to the change in the FAA rules allowing people to train for commercial in technically advanced aircraft, which basically means glass panel or retractable gear planes. And you used to have to do it in retractable gear planes. Not sure about that. But for most of the time that I was active with the club, the Moonies were flying about 30 hours a month, and we had 3 of them. So I'm not quite sure what's going on now. Part of it's probably the training issue, but they're just a fun plane to fly for travel, in my opinion. But like I said, looking at the alternatives, we did look at a number of aircraft alternatives. Maybe jump to the aircraft alternatives insert that I have on the page or two forward. Not the appendix, page, what page is this? PDF page 11 or 10. We looked at a number of, and thanks to Ken's work, we did a lot of financial modeling. We were building on work that had been done by a longtime member, Len Felton, in building the financial models that we largely used. Unfortunately, by the time the fleet committee was doing its work, James had a lot of other commitments and wasn't really able to participate in any vigorous manner. So those models have never been validated against the club's experience. But we used a lot of data that was available to the public on what it costs to fly these planes. And we believe we have pretty accurate financial models. If they're not absolute figures, they're definitely relative figures on what can be done. Big issues as we looked through these were what served the benefits of a training workhorse, what should we look at as long-term alternatives, and what does the advanced fleet need? A big question, of course, is when are we going to transition to glass? From the committee's perspective, it was not if, it was when. We figured it needed to be done in the 5 to 7 year time frame. A part that we struggled with tremendously was that where we thought glass could best be introduced into the fleet was at the high-end level, but there was nothing available at that level that seemed to have advantages over the existing fleet. There's a lot of detail on that in the report. Everybody jumps to the 172 G1000. The problem is you would have to charge in the range of $40 an hour more compared to the, because of its cost, at least at the time of the report, which makes it somewhat difficult. So it was an issue to monitor closely. It's an issue that the club needs to continue to wrestle with because eventually people are going to want to move there. Certainly people who want to move into the airlines want to get experience in glass. In my experience, I've flown G1000 172s. It's actually a pretty easy transition from steam gauges to G1000. In fact, it makes some instrument approaches look kind of ridiculously easy. The other side of it is it's more challenging to go the other direction, I could certainly see. So I think training in the basics, because that's what most GA pilots are going to fly for some time, unless they're going to buy their own plane, is highly desirable. Now, when I took over the fleet committee, Graham told me one thing is that I talk too much, and I've demonstrated that, I believe, tonight, but I wanted to kind of give an overview. But at this time, maybe I will take Graham's advice, and perhaps Graham could comment on whether we achieved what he wanted us to do when he appointed us, and then we could get Michael and Ken in to share their perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think we did. As I recall, there was quite the negotiation to get you to chair it. We came up with a charter that that you had to agree to, which kind of set the stage for what the committee was going to look at and what it wasn't. I don't know if we still have a copy of the charter. I think you actually incorporated it into the report.
The charter is an appendix to the report.
Gotcha.
There's also, Graham, in the appendix, the debate between you and John about whether the committee should address scheduling issues as part of the
right.
charter.
I think some of the kind of guiding principles like fleet commonality and so on that you touched on are kind of spelled out in that charter. But I think the committee did a great job. I think it met its remit extremely well. We got good information out of it about costs and so on that, you know, the fleet subcommittee of the fleet committee, which as I recall was Ken, me, and David Greenfield, and we met several times at Panera Bread in Cary. I think did some good work, particularly Ken. Ken was the real backbone of that. Investigating all of the airplane types and figuring out like how fast do they fly according to the POH and how many gallons do they burn and so on and so forth. It's a real treasure trove of data. And it also has quite a lot of good stuff about why we think what we think about all the different types of airplanes. And it kind of basically comes to the conclusion that what we've got is pretty much what we should have. That's a bit reductive. I mean, there's way more to it than that, but if you had to sum it up in a single sentence, we're doing pretty well. Like we've got airplanes that make sense for the purposes that we fly them for.
One of the things that the committee did, I thought pretty well, is look at the culture of the club before it started charging off looking at airplanes, which is a hard thing to pin down, but it's what makes the club special.
I think the fleet committee raised a concern that 152s are likely to get more expensive to maintain and keep flying as time goes on, which, you know, we should have bought stock in 152 Inc. because the committee was absolutely correct, and the cost of them has been going nowhere but up. The cost of parts has been going nowhere but up. And if we were to reconvene a new fleet committee today, that would be probably one of the main things we would look at is what is a primary trainer to replace the 152s? But I suspect that the answer would be there isn't one.
Yep.
That's an interesting comment, because Michael had sent an email to the three of us this morning suggesting that one of us comment on it. In the prior fleet committee that had been about 5 or 6 years before before the one that I chaired, had been chaired by Len, I mentioned that earlier. It would be an oversimplification, but just to be short, at that point in time, the Cessna Skycatcher was coming online. It looked like it was going to be a heck of a trainer. It was too expensive for us at the time, but we looked at it as, by the time the 152s would be reaching what we thought might be the end of their useful life, there would be 5-year-old Skycatchers around that we could start buying to replace the 152s. Well, as luck would have it, and these reports are kind of a point in time view, By the time the fleet committee was around that I chaired, Cessna had stopped, it sold the Skycatcher to the Chinese, who in turn had stopped making them. And they were completely unavailable, and you could get one on the used market, but since you couldn't get parts, maintenance, or anything else for them, they were not something that we could touch. I don't think the world has changed much since then. There's still not a trainer around that I know of that's as good a trainer as the 152.
I'll support that. Just from the look, certain aspects of looking at the market, the rest of the world has been buying 152s like crazy. There's so many that have been exported in the last 3 or 4 years because the rest of the world is hungry for that trainer. All of the talk in years gone by about the European trainers that are going to be built and the other things that come along, and the expansion of home builds into training have all failed, and everybody recognizes the trainer that works the best is a 152. And that's why the price of them has gone up, because they're just so scarce. One metric is that like 4 years ago, if you looked in Trade a Plane, there were at least 3 columns of 152s for sale every week and a half when that came out. And now there are maybe 5 to 10 152s for sale in that entire publication. And that publication is distributed worldwide. It's really absolutely amazing how in demand the 152s are at this time. And we're lucky to have as many as we do.
Ken or Mike, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just thinking about actually one of the things that's changed since that report. I've been enjoying looking back at the numbers that we came up with. We took our best estimate at what it would cost to acquire each of the airplanes that we considered. Looking at the 152s, we were estimating back then $27,500. I don't remember if that was the all-in, put it on the line cost or not, but still, within a Swagger, it's closer to 50,000 now. 4550 is what we're looking at. The 172s, we were estimating 150,000, which is that's not a small amount of money. And I mean, these days I think it'd be over 200 even to get one with quite a few hours on it. So it's interesting to see that some parts, and Cessnas in particular, seem to have really just taken off like crazy in the pricing. Warriors are actually about the same for some reason, and the Moonies as well. So it's just an interesting observation.
I think the manufacturers recognize the need. We've had Mooney try to come out with the M10, and we've had Piper try to come out with the Piper 100. There's a lot of people trying to make a 2-seater trainer, but for it to be affordable and practical and robust and withstand, abuse by students and easy to maintain and so on and so forth, it's a tall order. Like, that's not an easy thing to design and engineer.
Yeah, and we've seen Piper's actually been, I think it sounds like, more proactive in recent years about trying to cater to that market and producing, I couldn't tell you the model numbers or what they're calling them, but I think there's a 3-seater version for an observer in the back, aimed at some of the big flight schools and this sort of stuff. Whereas Cessna seems to have been limiting their production a bit more, which may account for what we see in the pricing difference. But Swami asked in the chat about using experimental aircraft, and I think we did actually consider the RV-12 for the basic fleet, and took that very seriously. And there's a whole analysis here. We've got the pros and the cons. I'm not sure what page this is, but it's down in the appendix. You can see the details of basically what we came up with there.
Yeah, you can't do initial private training in an experimental, though, unless I'm deeply wrong about the rules.
You can train in anything. That should be okay, I would think.
I was thinking we're not.
On the RV-12, I was just pulling it up. In the first place, they're not cheap, but um, they can be flown as a light sport. They have a reasonable useful load. They're easy cockpit entry, unlike some that are, we have mixed fiberglass is an issue for us since we don't put our planes in hangars. If you're not waxing them quarterly, putting them out under the sun is just not a way to longevity. The sun, go to any boatyard, the sun degrades glass reinforced plastic, the resins that are used in making those things over time. And unless they're well covered or well waxed, and we can barely get our planes washed once a year, it's a real issue to go to glass. So the RV-12, the advantage of being aluminum, it would mean introducing Rotex engines into the maintenance shop. It uses a stick control. It's hard to find ones that are certified, which was what I think Graham was getting at. There's issues with regard to a canopy opening. Some people like them, some people don't. They're really nice view from them, but if it's raining, your seat gets wet as you're trying to get in. If it's sunny out, they can get awfully hot. And we'd be training in glass panel. So basically we thought it was worth monitoring and continuing to monitor the RV-12s. I haven't kept up at that level, but nothing has just come to my attention, which was my earlier statement, that would really replace the 152s today as a basic trainer.
I was just impressed at the care and detail that you all took looking at all these alternatives. As you know, I became a big fan of the RV-12 when I flew Dix back from Oregon across the country. But everything you say about them that you said back in 2017 is true. And looking at the comparisons you all made here, the 152, the RV-12, the Diamond, the two-seat Diamond, and the 172, you looked at the possibility of basic 172 of VFR only 172 for primary training. And we are doing more primary training in the four-seat airplanes, the Skyhawks that we have now and the Warriors. I don't know why, whether that's scheduling, whether everybody just has more money now, or whether, well, we're all getting bigger as the years go by.
I think we're all just getting bigger.
Yeah, I think probably so. But I think you all nailed the pros and cons on each one of these options. And I will also say that as an instructor, the flight characteristics of the 152, I think, make it the best trainer I've ever seen, apart from all of the other operational considerations that you all have talked about here. And that's a very personal thing. You know, I've got a lot of hours in 152s, but it flies like a larger airplane. It has a very clear sight picture. So many of the other options, like the Diamonds and so on, are basically sailplanes that somebody put an engine on, and they fly like gliders, which is lovely if that's what you want to fly, but it doesn't really relate to flying a Skyhawk or a Mooney or a Cirrus or a TBM for that matter. Whereas a long time ago, Cessna had the idea. They would teach you to fly in a 152, sell you a 172, you get your instrument rating, sell you a 182, sell you a 210 for the larger family, and they'd sell you a turbo pressurized 210, and one day they'd sell you a Citation. So they had a line of airplanes that all flew like the next one up in the stack, and it's really true. And
one of the things that the committee talked about for the mid-level fleet is is a in the advanced, or really for the advanced fleet, is a 182. 180 that George had just mentioned. The transition from a 172 to a 182 is a very easy transition. Its flight characteristics as far as travel are very similar to our M20Js. It just does it in a different way. It's got that big honking engine out front, and it burns a lot of gas getting there. About $5 gallons more an hour than the Mooney, by my experience. But that's not what those numbers will show, because after much debate about what to do, because we all know sometimes the pilots, the POH wasn't exactly the same as what we had experienced. It's a practical matter. We decided that for comparison purposes, we really needed to follow the POH in every case. In any event, one of our recommendations was to keep our eye out for the upper range fleet for any 182s that might become available for lease on favorable terms. If the Moonies that we have are sports cars, the 182 is a station wagon. You really can put your family in a 182 with some luggage and go someplace. And it's a very nice plane in that regard, and it flies a lot like a 172, as long as you don't get too slow on the landing, because the front end of it wants to drop down on the runway. But it's a nice plane. But that doesn't address the issue of moving toward glass. I will say one thing that I'd meant to comment on earlier, and I made a note if I got the floor back for a second to comment on it. One other thing you can do with the fleet committee, the report, is if you look at the financial models, if you're in the market for a plane yourself, they might make a good starting point for you to look at of what it was going to cost you to own the plane. So they might be useful to some people on a personal basis. And if anyone wants the actual spreadsheets that are active as opposed to the PDF of these, Ken or I can make them available.
I have to say, I was really impressed with the detail and the research that went into compiling these models. This is an example that you all included in the report, but you did that same level of granularity and diligence on all of the aircraft models. I know Ken did a lot of this, and I'm sure he had help from others. And Ken, if there's anything you want to say about how these were structured, but I was always impressed with that. I also realized that back in about 05, 07, when we were buying the Skyhawks, I had a friend of mine who was all excited because he just gotten his MBA and wanted to build up some financial models. So he spent a week looking at the operational costs of Skyhawks and the club fleet, and cranked out a lot of computations and came up with a number. And when we went to a meeting to talk about all this, John was there, and John took a scrap of paper. You all probably can't see me right now, but about the size of a note card, licked the end of his pencil, sat down, made a few scribbles, handed it to me, and it was within like $3 of what my friend had come up with a week of computations. So to some extent, there's no mystery here, but when you're comparing apples and oranges in different airplanes, this is a really useful tool, as John said. Ken, do you want to say anything about how you built these up?
Well, I will comment that as John alluded to, and you just mentioned these, while these are not exact by any stretch of the imagination, the point was to try to do them all in a consistent manner, so that even though it may not be exactly right, at least you can compare apples to apples, and that was the intent of it. I will mention about the purchase prices. Those were the purchase price, not just to buy the aircraft. We just pulled some numbers from the local publications at the time, but we also looked at what they came equipped with and what it would cost them to modify them to what we would want as standards for the club to put them on the line. So the purchase price you see on those is to put them on our line. Michael's only really wasn't sure if it was or not, but those were the values to put them on our line, equipped the way we would want them equipped. Everything else we tried to pull numbers as reasonably could. I mean, obviously you can get engine prices all over the place. I'll be updating if I ever get the chance, I'll update the one on an SR-22 since I've just had to buy one.
An engine, not an SR-22.
Yeah, an engine for an SR-22. So
Okay.
I got a really good number for that one now. But the intent really was to try to compare apples as apples the best we could with this. And there's probably more detail in here than was required, but we wanted to try to make sure we covered it as thoroughly as we could and understood what the costs really were.
I mean, you've included the subscriptions for the avionics here. You've looked at a serious look at insurance costs, estimated annuals cost, oil filter, oil usage. There's a lot of research that went into this. The cost of capital, of course, that would change from year to year. Parachute, you anticipated that because we're looking at a series here. I mean, each one of these line items represents a lot of research.
Well, and another part is you kind of pointed to it. The part on the right says cost calculations, annual, dollars per hour, and percentage. You can really see the things that really drive the hourly cost if you look down that. And you can see some of them, it really didn't matter that we included them, but we included them in there just for thoroughness.
If there's one sensitivity that kind of outweighs everything else when you get to the hourly costs, it's the number of hours you assume. And whether you assume the same thing across the fleet or the different parts of the fleet, which is what we ultimately decided to do. Because there's a significant component of fixed costs, particularly if you include cost of capital in owning an airplane, which the club does, because of that component of fixed costs, the more hours you fly it, the better off you're going to be, at least up to a certain point. So the costs probably are a little less than we're showing there because the hours are up compared to what they were in 2017.
Well, I'd like this to go back to that because this ties in with what you said about surveys and our experience early on. And the reason that the tail dragger didn't last, which was clamored for by some, and the great surge of saying we've got to have a 6-seater. You know, I'll quit the club if I can't get one because I got to get one. I have a third child came along, and we need it, and we bit the bullet and got a Cherokee 6, and then it was crashed. Of course, that didn't help us. We got a replacement Cherokee 6. And it just didn't fly. And so you're exactly right. You have this capital cost in there, but what it boiled down to is all these people who clamored for it and took the survey. And the part of the surveys we used to do was how many hours would you fly, get real, and they made estimates how they'd fly. And you look at the numbers and say, gosh, we could buy 2 if they flew that much. So we'll get 1. And it just didn't work. The specialty airplanes flew on the holidays when people wanted to take a vacation, and then they'd become the private province of usually one person who had the money to go ahead and fly the more expensive airplane, and they didn't fly it that much. So we just learned the hard way with the 182 that we had on lease. The guy just took it back. He left it with us for about 6 months. Says, "I'm sorry, you're losing money. I'm losing money. I'm just going to take it and sell it." Ended up leasing it to the check carriers over at Raleigh. But that was a bust. The tail dragger was a bust. The Cherokee 6 was a bust. And apparently, I didn't know this, the 300 horsepower Mooney didn't work out too well either in terms of hours. But hours, you're absolutely right. If you don't get the hours for your projections, it just hurts every way you can look at it.
The fixed costs just eat you alive.
Yeah.
The 6-seat airplane is in my anecdotal experience, by far the most requested airplane.
Yep.
It's whenever this subject comes up, that's the one airplane people most want. And we've tried it. I'm not one of these people that says we tried it, it doesn't work, so we shall never try it again.
Yeah.
Times change, lots of things change, but it's very difficult because, as John says, everybody wants to check out in it, and then they want to fly it twice a year, the first week in August for summer vacation and Thanksgiving, and can't everybody fly it for Thanksgiving? So it just sits there and eats you alive.
Yeah, and I think
Well, the S was an interesting case because I've now pulled up the survey just to refresh my recollection. But we had 35 respondents who said they wanted to fly the S. Those 35 respondents flew 660 hours in the year that was in question. And they each said they would use the Mooney 12-hour up to 12 hours a month, and the mean was 10, which we didn't really believe, but the hours should have been fantastic on that. It was also an interesting plane because on a 400-mile flight, the cost was the same as the J's. The reason was it was sufficiently faster than the J's that the hourly rate that we charged for the J's became insignificant because of the amount of time you made up in the faster plane, because it would cruise at about 185 knots. Or so people said. It was more like 180, but it was still haul. So it was an ideal plane for me because I like to fly from TTA to Evansville, but with some degree of frequency. But it didn't work out for the club. The reason was that even though the people, me, Courtney, a couple of other pilots loved the plane, if you weren't going to fly it a lot, it was expensive to stay current. Staying current in the plane cost me about $1,000 a year. And you couldn't break even on that. So it was a commitment to fly the plane and stay current in it.
You know, interestingly enough, the comparison between the J and the S model is also true of, say, the Skyhawk and the Mooney, depending on how we set the rates. On a long trip, the Mooney is economical as a Skyhawk, give or take. Whenever we promote the use of the Moonies, we always make that point. But it's staying current that makes it expensive. But on a long trip, the Mooney is as economical at club rates as the Skyhawk, in part because of the speed and in part because of the range. You don't have to make the fuel stop, which just kills you in time and danger and hazard and everything else. So, but we've just...
That was certainly a big deal with it for me, because my wife and I had kind of have a agreement that we won't fly more than 2.5 hours without a comfort stop. So in the J, that meant TTA to Evansville was going to have a fuel stop in it. As a practical matter, it turned the 3.5 to 4 hour flight into a 5 hour flight when you get the stop in there. Whereas in the S, we could fly straight through, pushing it a little bit. So that was a really big deal. But it was a bad club. It was a bad plane for the club. And I don't know whether Lloyd kept it after he pulled it off the club's line, but I think it was averaging, Ken, you would know off the top of your head, less than 10 hours a month.
Yeah, on average, it was less than 10. Probably the largest month I see for it was like 26 hours. And that was probably one of the months where Lloyd had flown it up to the Northeast.
By the
Yeah.
way, Lloyd does still own it and still flies it. Maybe not as often, but you still see it. It's still his. I did want to add one thing to that discussion about if I can also share something. I wrote this a while ago. I actually used to fly up to the extreme Northeast, Blacksburg, New York, which is near Burlington, Vermont. I made the trip in a 172, and a couple of years later, I made the same trip in a Mooney. And so I had side-by-side data to compare. You know, the 172 required a fuel stop, the Mooney did not. And I wrote up a comparison of it. And the bottom line is the price was within $10 for both planes, right? So, you know, the Mooney cost more per hour, but flew fewer hours and skipped a fuel stop. But over the course of the round trip, it was, I think, like, let me see, it was like $1,407 for the 172 and $1,416 for the Mooney. And it's a 1,200 nautical mile round trip. So it was just interesting to see the, but there was some other benefits too. Like, and when I took the Mooney with no fuel stop, I flew almost the entire time over an undercast that I would have had to descend through and do an approach to make a fuel stop, right? Which that would have not been as safe in the 172. But, you know, I do have that side-by-side comparison of actual flights that I could show. Oh, one other thing about the 172 that made it more costly was that it was so slow. By the time I got into the RDU area, Sanford was fogged in, they had to land at RDU and then come and get it the next day, right? Compared to the Mooney.
I would like to get back to the club some issues that I see facing the club from a fleet perspective. And George or people who are closer to the club I see it from afar, which has the advantage of me being able to take kind of a high level view. It has the disadvantage of it may not have any connection with the reality on the ground. But at this point in time, I see kind of three issues for the club from a fleet point of view. Actually four, if you include the coronavirus and see how ours and all come back, because then it's just a question of how many planes does the club need, and it has to address that. But some of the issues that the fleet committee dealt with before are probably more ripe for decision now. One is, what do we do training long term? If we're going to stick with 152s, we may need to buy some more newer ones. We may want to hang on to the ones we have. I'm not sure how expensive they are, but that's certainly an issue. I don't know what's going on with the high-end fleet. I don't know whether we can prime the pump or whether the club members have different demands than they did in the past, or whether you have fewer traveling members. I mean, Courtney, Len, me were at least three of the bigger traveling members who liked Moonies. I don't know what's going on there now, but I know the hours are struggling month in and month out. And finally, the club's got to wrestle with the issue at some point of transition to glass, because certainly anybody who wants a career in the airlines is going to want to learn glass. We were hoping that something would get certified for Moonies so that we can move glass into the high end of the fleet, which would have been ideal. I don't know whether any of that's happened. I do notice that the club has begun putting electronic, those Garmin units in to replace some of the old vacuum powered instruments, which is kind of a soft transition because people will get used to using those. But I've talked with George, or at least exchanged emails with George on this subject before, but I think the club also has to face a training reality that over time, what people are really going to do once they've learned to fly is use probably an iPad or some type of electronic flight bag And in doing so, when they started out, they were pretty straightforward. Now they're pretty complicated. If you've grown up with them, using them, they're pretty easy to use because, you get an update and you just learn a few new features. But if you are a new person coming into using them, there is a lot to learn. And I think the club needs to begin to address the issue of training for new pilots coming in to learn not only paper charts, but also learn how they're going to fly every day, which is electronic. So that's 5 issues that I think the club needs to address in the fleet area, and including one training issue. I don't know what others might be out there, but those are the ones I've identified.
Don, you will be pleased to know that I now fly with a marvelous digital simulation of the E6B on my iPad. So I'm moving into the digital age.
I think it'll be great when we see John Hunter with a digital version of the E6B.
Well, we were all shocked years ago to discover that John had his own website. So who knows what secrets he holds. That's a legitimate question though, John, and it's not a fleet question necessarily. We know that we will ultimately go to digital instruments because they're cheaper to manufacture. It's inevitable. How we do it, and you're right, one of the big questions at every time when you looked at this issue back in 2017, one of the issues for the club is, do you do it whole hog or do you do it piecemeal? And we have sort of slipped into doing it piecemeal because we're putting G5s in airplanes because it's just getting too expensive to keep replacing spinning gyros. So we're kind of making that decision by default almost, and whether that's wise or not, I don't know. There's always a question of owning versus leasing, and for a while we leased a lot of airplanes. John knows the history of that because he was part of it. We've moved gradually back to owning our own airplanes, and that just depends on how you feel about debt versus equity. And the training issue, we have a vivid argument among our instructor corps about that. How long we cling to the old school principles. I think we agree that it is worth teaching those old school principles, but you're right, let's not kid ourselves. That's not the way anybody flies anymore. And we've taken the attitude for a long time. We're going to teach people how to draw lines on a chart and plot a course, and I believe we should continue to do that, but we have also taken the view that they will figure out how to use ForeFlight all by themselves. And some will and some won't, and that can be misused. Ken, you found something interesting on the current version of ForeFlight today. I didn't get a chance to read the details.
Yeah, it's actually not just the current version. It's actually been there. I found it in December. George, as you know, I fly to New Orleans quite a bit and just happened to plan a route and did what's called an airway to airway route. So it went Victor 155, Victor 20. So the flight was KTTA, Sand Hills, Victor 155, Victor 20 to Slid to New Orleans. If you do that, ForeFlight draws it out perfectly fine on its map. Then when you go to file it, that is not at all what it sends in the flight plan. It sends a very circuitous route because it doesn't quite know how to deal with the Victor 155 to Victor 20 transition. If you try to do this in flightplan.com, it won't even let you file it that way. It turns out that there's the US automated routing system allows airway to airway. ICAO doesn't recognize it. So to get around that issue, you need to put a fix in where you're trying to transition from one airway to the other. And why ForeFlight generates it correctly on the map and not on the flight plan it submits to ATC, I don't know. But they're aware of the problem. They've been aware of it since December. I just forgot about it until this downtime when I had a little more time to play around and tried it. And sure enough, it's still there.
So you have to specify the fix at which you make that changeover?
That's correct. If you, it may work correctly, it may not. It just happens, and I suspect it has to do with whatever algorithm they're using to decide how they generate the route. Like I say, it generates the correct route on the map. And actually, if I take that route from ForeFlight and push it over to the GPSs on the Cirrus, it actually shows up correctly on there. But if I file the flight plan, and you can actually create a hard copy of the flight plan to see what's actually getting submitted, it actually changes the route quite dramatically. It actually, as you fly to Sandhills, do a 180-degree turn, go back to Ochock, then take a northwest leg up to Greensboro, sort of, and then it goes down Victor 20. It just, no rhyme or reason. And it actually looks like somebody has filed it that way, and that's, I'm sure when they took off and flew it, they were very, very surprised that it was not the actual route they thought they were going to get.
Sure, not helpful. Fascinating.
It's just one of those things, if you're going to use modern technology, you need to sort of check on, is it really doing what you think it's doing? Kind of like autopilots. Is it really doing what you think it's going to be doing?
Sure. One of the, when we first were putting GPSs in our airplanes, one of the wisest things anybody ever taught me, Phil Betts said, whenever you do anything, check the flight plan, because that's what's going to happen, not what you think is going to happen or hope is going to happen. So, you know, that wanders on into training issues and everything else, but anybody have any thoughts about owning versus leasing?
I have an opinion on that. I've always thought that leasing for the club would be a great way to explore some of these areas. I mean, like we did it with Delta Romeo. Mm-hmm. Okay, as long as the club's not at risk, why not give it a shot? If it had worked and people had flown the lights out of it, great. It didn't work out. It didn't sink the club because of the terms we did for it. I think that'd be a great way to try to move into glass panels. Find somebody that's willing to lease a 152, a 172, or a 182 glass. Give it a shot. See, do people fly it? And I don't mean just for the first couple of months when everybody's getting checked out in it, but does it last for a few months and people really fly it? Then we got another valid data point.
But that assumes a pricing point, which also has to be taken into account, because if you get a good deal on a lease and you can price it low, you get a lot of people to fly it. But then if you decide to buy it and you say, we can't match that sweetheart deal, then it might turn that into something else.
Well, but we could price it such that it would be at the same rate as to what we would have to charge if we bought it.
I see. Yeah.
We just need to set up the leasing term so that we don't get killed by it.
Right.
Yeah. Our most successful leases have always been with club members because mostly they have no illusions about making money on that lease.
All right. Well, we certainly can't lease it from somebody that thinks they're going to make money on it, because that's just, I don't think that's ever been the case. Somebody makes money on, well, except for Jim Carlson. He makes a boatload of money on 6-4 Tango Zulu.
Yeah.
We're looking into that.
Yeah, I can tell you, there's definitely no boatload of cash coming out of my pockets on that.
What? He does? I didn't know about this.
Yeah, really. No, I wanted to chime in. I think that, you know, when you have a lease back, you have to understand a couple of factors that people don't recognize. One, there's this thing called cost of capital. And as a lessor, you cannot think in terms of recovering your cost of capital. So if you've got a loan that you've taken out to buy that airplane, you're paying for that loan. And so that usually is the number one killer for somebody wanting to lease their aircraft back. You don't make money on a lease. What you get with a lease back basically is an offset of your maintenance. If I was flying the plane, if Mike and I just owned the plane as partners and we flew the hours we flew, we'd have a lot more maintenance costs because it'd be sitting in a hangar a lot more.
It's probably worth stating, just for anybody who's not aware, that you guys own 6-4 Tango Zulu and lease it to the club. And that's the one airplane that is in the club fleet currently that's a lease.
Right.
John, you leased airplanes to the club for years. I will say that you got into that business, if you will, in large part to save the club from financial ruin back in the early 80s when there was a major recession. Not a crash. We try to keep the terms financial when we're talking about that. Earlier you said there was a large crash.
Yeah, well, I can tell you
in the 1970s, but
yeah,
and we've all heard that story. In January, the club flew 1 hour and so on, and you couldn't sell the airplanes, you couldn't give them away, and so you and several partners stepped in and bought airplanes from the club at a fair price, which we probably couldn't get anywhere else, and then leased them back to the club, and it kept the club going. And that continued for a lot of years, and we gradually took back ownership of those airplanes.
Yeah. And that was the idea, that some of us really cared that the club not collapse, and that's exactly what happened. And we did have to take out loans to buy them. And what we did is we basically did a lot of maintenance ourselves, and just that was the initial people involved in that, Bobby, what was his last name? And Ray Kirk and I, and then Doug.
Stan Munsett.
Yeah, a lot of people got involved to try to do this, but it really, as we keep telling our wives, no, we're not making any money, but at least we're not, we got enough to pay the loans, and that was it, if we do all the maintenance ourselves. And that's what it boiled down to, the free maintenance.
Sure.
But the whole idea was, the club was bankrupt. If the banks had called the loans, it would all have been over right there. And so the idea was to lease them back in a way that every time they flew, the club would make some money. And so that was the whole deal. And we sold them back one at a time. We had a fleet of 9 of them, and sold them all back until the club now owns all of them that we had at the time. And what I was going to say about leases, at least in my view at the time, it's a very simple equation. If the airplanes are flying enough, the economy is strong enough, and you have enough membership flying the airplanes, the club should own them, because they're going to build the capital that way. If the times are iffy, find the leases. And then if it doesn't fly, you don't get burned. Which is the other thing that we had with our leases. We had sliding scales, so that the more they flew, the less the lessor got per hour. The less they flew, the rate went up. So that the idea of this was fair, that if they flew a lot, both parties would profit, as opposed to the lessor making out really well and the club not so much. If they didn't fly, the cost went up, so you both shared the pain. So that was the kind of lease we had that seemed to work quite well for years on all those airplanes. But anyway, that's the assumption that when you lease and when you buy your own.
Well, I've always thought of leasing as much like every other kind of debt. You can lease airplanes, which is just a way of benefiting current members, perhaps at the expense of future members, just like any other debt. And you can try to own the airplanes, which is a way of benefiting future airplanes when you have built up equity in those airplanes and you can fly them for less money. So it's almost like the whole question of how much debt the club should carry, which is something that gets addressed periodically. Jim, I think you were saying something and I cut you off.
Well, there were two comments I wanted to make. One was, our lease is like you talk about, what John Hunter was talking about. It's a sliding scale. The only difference is we don't have a minimum payment. So, like the months right now while we're shut down, our expenses are positive and our income is negative. So, this month, when we end the month, we're going to be paying an insurance payment that will put us negative and owing the club money for that payment. The other thing is, what really got me involved in leasing was 917 was leased by another club member at the time, and it wasn't being taken care of, and I felt like the lease money that was being put into it wasn't being plowed back into it to improve it, and so I ended up going and negotiating to buy it so that I could fix it up, because I wanted to be able to say that I always my feeling in the years that I was on the club was the club really didn't need new planes. it needed nice planes, you know, and as long as the planes were in good flying order and looked nice, they were nice. And we've always tried to improve the internals and the avionics along the way. It's not glass, but it's closer to glass with the 650 in it and the G5s, and eventually we'll have another G5, and we're going to improve the autopilot. So we're trying to make it, keep moving it, the bar up a little bit each time.
It sets the standard among our warriors, no question about that.
Which brings up the issue of fleet commonality, which was a really big thing in my mind for years, that each segment of the fleet should be interchangeable, so you don't have to worry about, especially low-time pilots, having to get checked out and remembering which airplane they were in and what equipment was in it and how it worked. I mean, this is a known safety factor in the airline industry, absolutely. And the FAA enforces it, that all the switches have to be in the same places and the same type. You can't mix and match your 737s. They have to be conform. And so that principle was something we tried to work on to make sure that we, all the 172s, no matter which one you got into, you wouldn't have to sit there and wonder, what was installed and how to work it. It would all be the same. And I don't know whether that's still a priority or not, but that's something I just want to throw out there.
It's still definitely.
That was something we did try to consider when we were looking at it. That's why we had a cost, that the purchase price that we had in those sheets were to put it on the line, and that was to try to get it to conform to sort of what we wanted in a plane, with whether it's a certain type of autopilot or GPS, whatever. So we did try to take that into account as much as we could there, that way.
Yeah, I think it's a principle that remains. It's getting more and more difficult with the increasing costs of things like HSIs and attitude indicators and so on, and the attractiveness of some of the digital replacements. And it's harder to find airplanes out in the market that have that kind of standardization or commonality, and as Ken says, it's expensive to create that. So I think it's getting harder and harder to do, particularly as avionics become more of the cost of an airplane. We used to buy a Skyhawk and it had 6 steam gauges and a fuel gauge and an oil temperature and oil pressure, and that was about all you needed. But now people expect more in the way of avionics.
I think as the airplanes are getting older too, if we wanted to get another Warrior of the same vintage that we have, it's been through how many generations of avionics upgrades over those years. So maybe that first generation of upgrades, they all stayed somewhat similar because the owners had similar options. But when you get through multiple iterations of that, they just get further apart. And we certainly saw that with, to some extent, with 140 Foxtrot that we bought last year. That brought up something I wanted to actually come back to. The Fleet Committee report was really useful in that decision-making process last year, as the board was discussing last year capacity issues and the prospect of just expanding the fleet to make sure we had enough flying capacity to keep instructors and students flying, and we had this waiting list and so on. We looked back at that Fleet Committee report. We looked at those types, broken out as trainer and mid-fleet. And advance is very clear that the mid-fleet, it seems, is the right place to expand. We could see when you added together our existing Skyhawks and Warriors, which have been our mid-fleet for quite a while, the total trend there was just going crazy up and to the right. So that made a lot of sense to add capacity there. I ended up writing up, several-page, basically, pitch toward the end as this particular opportunity came up with 140 Foxtrot for the club to purchase it, basically advocating for those things and certainly citing back to the Fleet Committee report from 2017. That was a very helpful framework that has continued to serve the club.
Well, thank you. Actually, I found that whole episode kind of funny because I hadn't known the club was really thinking about that plane until they did it, because I kind of drift in and out a bit. And many people know that when I flew mid-range planes, while I was checked out in the Warriors, I mostly flew the 172s when I wasn't flying the Moonies. So right after the club decided to buy the Warrior, I got contacted by some of the members that were basically saying, you know, what do you think of this? Because they thought I wouldn't like the decision. But as soon as I heard it, with the framework of the fleet committee work, I said, it's the perfect decision. It's exactly what I would have done, because it did make sense. It adds the capacity to the mid-range fleet and does it at a more reasonable price than the 172 would have. I mean, one of the good things about the mid-range fleet, we talked about this a bit in the committee. I think it was a brilliant decision that was made before I had any responsibility for any of this, to standardize the fleet, to standardize the avionics on the Garmin 650, 750 line, because switching back and forth, for example, from the electronics that were in 2.6 mic to the electronics that were in the other planes, really required some thought process, and at times was, if I switched back and forth too much, I found almost dangerous, which is why most people didn't like the electronics in 2.6 mic. I thought they were great, as did Ken. So Ken and I flew 2.6 mic, and everybody else flew the other Moonies. But that's the other thing about how you fly them. Since the Warriors and the 172s, they've got a lot of differences to them. But as John beat into everybody's head, you tend to revert to your basic training when something goes wrong. The fact of the matter is that if you fly speeds that are in your head for a 172 in a Warrior, you're not going to get hurt. And vice versa. If you fly speeds that you fly in a Warrior and you fly them in a 172, they're generally the same for approach, landing, whatever you're doing. Now, the Moonie isn't like that. It's different. But it does have one advantage, and it makes it very easy when you have the avionics the same and you essentially have all the speeds the same. That makes the mid-range fleet, in my mind, very comparable and very safe.
You know, we have gone back and forth over the years between high wing and low wing airplanes in that mid-range. There have been times when we had all Skyhawks, and then times when we had all Warriors. And then somebody comes along and decides that Cessnas are better in some way, and then someone decides that low-wing airplanes look sexier, and we've gone back and forth. You remember back when we sold off a number of the Warriors back around 05 or 07, and I suggested to John Demena that he just buy the Warriors from the club and he could sell them back in a few years because we'd want them back, and he did. That's how we sold off 80 Alpha and then bought it back from John about 3 years later. And they're functionally equivalent airplanes, really. So, Grover, I noticed in the chat here, if Grover's still with us, you made a question or remark that the Mooney Club regulations were what made it unfeasible to fly. Yes. Perhaps you're talking about the Continental engined Mooney. Those were correct. Available when the survey was taken. What did you mean by that?
I took part in that survey originally. I was intending to fly the plane, and we didn't really know exactly what the cost of flying the plane was going to be at the time. And as a result, the survey was done premature, in my opinion, to get a realistic picture of what number of hours it might have flown. And that was borne out ultimately, I think, because the number of hours that were flown were down significantly from what were estimated. So the reason for my not flying it was because of the club regulations that required it being, like John said, It cost him $1,000 a year just to stay current in the plane. That just made it unfeasible for me, you know.
Sure. No, that's a situation we run into all the time, and it's always a balance. How much can you ask of people in terms of currency and proficiency, because we know that drives the cost up.
Yeah.
And when you conduct a survey like that, it's always optimistic. You say, well, if we got a 6-seat airplane, how much would you fly it? And people always overestimate that. And we, you know, a good friend of mine had to have a Cirrus, so the previous owner of 26 Mike, many of us know him. He had to have a Cirrus so he could get to Florida, where his wife spent winters, 20 minutes quicker, and he burned up all of his money staying current and proficient in the Cirrus. And then when he had to go to Florida, he'd just buy a ticket on JetBlue for $1.25. And he never actually got to use the airplane because, and that's a dilemma for any owner of an airplane, the cost of staying current and proficient in it. And it's a dilemma for the club. How much can we reasonably expect of people in terms of currency and proficiency? We know that makes them safer. We also know it's expensive. And it's, John,
I don't remember, did the insurance company put any requirements as far as Delta Romeo? Because what I'm getting at is, you know, since I fly Cirrus, our insurance company says that every one of my partners and I have to do an instrument proficiency check every year in the Cirrus, which is much like doing a club annual. So, well, yeah, that might make it expensive. That's not unusual for a high performance aircraft for the insurance company to require that.
That's true. I don't remember offhand about.
The answer is no, but as a practical matter, the insurance company knows what our club manual says and the additional requirements in the manual for a high performance aircraft. So since you have to do a club annual in that aircraft if you're going to fly it, and a club annual for all practical purposes includes an FAA IPC, they didn't need to require it because the club rules already did.
I think that's true of a lot of the things that we ask of our members. If we did not, number one, we would have a more difficult time getting the kind of coverage we have. You may remember that a week or two ago on one of these forums, I showed a letter from Dick Kenny to the club, basically saying that, this was from a few years back, but basically saying, I'm having a difficult time finding an underwriter who wants to cover the club for the reasons that we've talked about many times. That's a good question. How much of that was just club policy and how much of it was mandated? Hard to tease them apart because, as you say, John, if we had not, the underwriter might very well have.
What is the origin of the Mooney 6-month check? That seems to me more like a club decision.
It is, and I can tell you the origin of it. We had too many people pranging the Moonies. It's pretty difficult to go somewhere and rent a Mooney unless you have prior experience in type. And we know why. They are not an idiot-proof airplane. They are designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to go fast, very efficiently. And they make a lot of compromises to achieve that. The laminar flow wing, the gear, and we just had too many people pranging Moonies. Sometimes it was just landing with the brakes on, but more often it was landing on the nose wheel. And we had to rebuild or replace engines. We had to replace props. And it was just very apparent that moving, you know, I started off last week by saying what we do in the club is designed to cause accidents. And taking people whose only experience is in a Cessna and putting them into a Mooney with 150 hours or 250 without an instrument rating, we pranged a lot of airplanes. If all you've ever experienced is landing a 152 or a 172 and you step into a Mooney, that's the sort of thing that's going to happen. And we had it happen too often. even though we emphasize this on our checkouts. When I train the instructors on the mooning, we talk about it a lot. But we prang too many airplanes. And so we said, look, we're letting you move into a moonie with 150 hours total time. That's unheard of. So until you acquire a good deal more time in the moonie, we're going to ask that you come back every 6 months and demonstrate that you can at least land the airplane safely. That's where that came from. Has it helped? I don't know. We've not pranged one in a while. And the fact that even our instructors who are low time in the mooning are required to do that, maybe it helps. Maybe it keeps it front of mind for the instructors. I don't know. Maybe the random distribution has just gone easy on us for the last year or two. I don't know.
Yeah, you ought to take a look at the flat spots on the tires on the 172. They even brand new tires within a few days, they're getting flat spotted really badly right now.
They are on the 172s as well.
That's what I was just saying.
I'm sorry. I mean on the Warriors as well.
Yeah, that's always been a thing. John, you remember when back in Chapel Hill, you had a rogues gallery of tires up in the shed that all had flat spots or holes burned in them. It is a constant issue with the club, which doesn't mean that we should be okay with it. It doesn't mean we should just shrug our shoulders at it. We emphasize that a lot, and it drives all of us absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I went up with Grover not that long ago, and one of the tires on the 172 looked more like an octagon than it did a circular tire.
Sure, you can feel it when you taxi. Thump, thump, thump. It's crazy, and I don't know.
I've got a request for people. There's a lot of people on here. I'm not sure how many people have ever looked at the fleet committee report. I think we've got a fair number of new people that may be hearing some of this. I'd like to ask you guys, if you've never looked at that report, to download it, read through it. If you see some things you either agree or disagree with, or things we need to look at again, to throw those things back up to us, let us know what we might want to look at going forward.
Yeah, that would be really helpful because it's such a good template. We're going to need to do this again, and the report said so.
Yeah, well, we've tried to aim for 5 years, and that would be a good, that would come up in another year and a half or so. But one of the things I just want to throw out there, the question came up, how long will the airframes last in the 152s? Cessna builds stout airplanes. Unless you run them, have an accident there, the airframes are pretty darn bulletproof. If we just continue on with decent maintenance, they've never given any problem. If we have to crash them or drive a Mooney through a 152 wing, that's a problem. But other than that, they can go on amazingly. In terms of certification, there is a program that Cessna's come out with for aging airplanes, and as long as we do that and keep examining for corrosion and keep corrosion off them, there's no reason those airframes can't go on for another 10,000 hours. Easy. Just FYI.
Well, that is a question that always comes up. How long you keep flying these airplanes? Cape Air up in New England, well, they're now all over the country, all over the world, flew the Cessna 402s, completely different airplane. And as you know, John, the twins were built in a different place with a whole different process than the singles. But they put not just hours, but an incredible number of cycles on them because they were doing short hops. And they would just take them apart, bring them in the hangar, take them apart, and put them back together again every so many years, every so many hours. It's a question of parts. It's a question of cost. And everyone here may or may not know that shortly before our whole world turned upside down, the club was moments away from buying another 152. And we were going to spend, I know Jeff was here earlier, I hope he still is, we were going to spend about $45,000 for a 152. Can you imagine that, John?
Good deal.
And, yeah, and it's a good deal, and we looked a long time for it.
Right. Well, I think, but the point I was trying to make, the airframes of small airplanes, as opposed to the parts that you're going to use in even a brand new one. In other words, we don't buy many airframe parts. If we prang it, yeah. But basically we're buying tires, wheels, brakes, the interior parts you tear up, but we don't buy wings. We don't buy ailerons. We don't buy, control surfaces unless we hurt them. And those are the ones that, and the landing gear on the Cessnas is about as stout as you can get.
We prove that every day.
So anyway, I wouldn't worry about the 152s right now in terms of longevity.
Yeah. Well, Grover, if you've got any idea how we can stop people from putting flat spots on the tires, let me know.
Well, I think it comes back to the primacy of instruction.
Yep.
It's how you learn it from the get-go and how to apply the brakes. I guess you really need to stress it.
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree with that. It's primary instruction, early primary instruction, and it can be avoided. But boy, it's a hard thing to do when the fear factor of students is when to get on the brakes real fast. It's hard to unlearn once you start doing it.
My suspicion is it's probably gotten a bit worse because you're seeing more people doing their commercial training in the Warriors and the 172s.
It could be. Yeah, it could be. Well, we have an instructor who flunked his CFI check ride because he didn't brake hard enough on his short field landing demonstration. Because he had learned over 35 years of flying, don't jump on the brakes. If you land slow enough and short enough, you don't really need to. And he failed his CFI check ride. Well, this is fascinating. I'll stay here and talk about airplanes in the club all night long, but that was really what I wanted to talk about. This has been really useful. That report, I had not looked at it for a long time, and I went back and read it through today, and I was just very impressed with the methodology, with the fact that it started out by looking at what the club is and what's important about its culture and the kind of people that have made it successful, and did not get distracted by shiny objects, and took a real hard-nosed look at the options and where we were, and created templates like the financial analysis that you all did, that are templates that we can use again the next time we look at this. The facts on the ground will change, but the methodology, I think, is really, really sound and will stand up for a long time. And I wish everybody would read it. It would give people a real idea.
George, somebody on the chat asked what would an Arrow be a reasonable alternative to a Mooney?
No, an Arrow is a ridiculous airplane. They had no excuse for ever living.
This is how a fleet committee operates. George understands this.
No, I mean, it, and I don't mean to be snarky about it. The Arrow is why we have the technically advanced airplane regulation, because old flight schools got tired of maintaining old Arrows just so they could do commercial training in them, because you needed a retractable gear airplane, and an Arrow doesn't carry any more, doesn't go any faster than a Warrior basically, and costs a lot more to maintain with a retractable gear. The Archer is the next step up from the Warrior.
And then it turns out that doesn't carry much more in the Warrior either, nor go that much faster.
No.
The Mooney is a choice, just to give you an idea why we went to the Mooney. Not only is it efficient, the gear maintenance is about zero on a Mooney. You replace rubber pucks and occasionally a bushing, and that gear is just absolutely bulletproof. Whereas when you have gear like you have on Cessnas, especially on 210s, which is ridiculous,
Sure.
but the and Warriors, you have all kinds of hydraulics and pumps, and they're expensive. The Mooney is El Cheapo for
Sure.
a retractable gear. It's just bulletproof.
Well,
And
it's basically the old Johnson bar gear. They just hung a motor on it.
that's right, exactly.
Yeah, that's true. So arrows are what all the flight schools wanted to unload, and that's why they essentially drove the FAA to allow the technically advanced airplane to serve as a complex airplane for the purpose of acquiring the 10 hours you need for a commercial certificate, and drove the FAA into allowing people to do their commercial and CFI check ride in a 152 if you want to, so that the flight schools could unload all those old arrows that were getting to be a pain to maintain. And whenever you look at an airplane for the club, at that end of the fleet, you've got two issues. It was a problem when you look for a twin that might work in the club. You all may probably don't remember, but back in the 90s, I was president of the club for a few years, and people came to me and said, we need to get a twin. And I said, no and hell no. It's not going to be flown enough by members of the club, and it's just going to raise the cost of the 152s and the 172s. But if you think that the club can support a twin, go buy one and prove that there's enough interest and enough people who fly it, and that it's not going to be just like the Cherokee 6 that everybody wants to check out in and then will never fly. And so a group of people, including me in a sense, looked at it, and you could get a Baron, which is an awesome airplane to fly somewhere in for a piston twin, but it's too expensive to train in. And you could get a
310.
No, yeah, that would be like a Baron, but or you could get one of the, what's the Piper twin that's basically a Warrior with two engines that everybody uses for training?
Seneca.
No, not the
Aztec.
Seneca, not the
Aztec.
Aztec.
No, say again.
Seminole?
Apache.
Oh, bingo, bingo. You could get a Seminole, but it goes, slower than a Skyhawk and costs a lot more money to fly. That's an exaggeration, but it offers no travel advantage over the airplanes that we already have in the fleet. So you can get an airplane you can train in, like a Seminole, but nobody's ever going to go anywhere in it because it doesn't go fast enough and it costs a lot to fly. Or you can get an airplane like a Baron, which is a fantastic airplane if you want to fly across the country, but it's just too expensive to train in for the club's audience. So that's how we ended up with twin Comanches, because it both goes faster, flies farther, offers a real advantage to travel, and it's affordable to train in. And that's where the Mooney lies. It is affordable enough to fly, unlike, say, a Bonanza or 836. It's affordable enough to fly to use for training, and we did a lot of commercial training in the Moonies back in those days because you had to have a complex airplane to do commercial training. So it was affordable enough to do training in, and at the same time it offered a real advantage if you wanted to fly to Evansville or New Orleans, because it gave you the speed and it was so efficient that it was not brutally expensive to fly like an A36 would be. So it hit that sweet spot. It had utility for training and for travel, and that's what's made the Moonies so successful for us over the years, other than the fact that we keep pranking them. But it's why the Mooney's been so successful for us. And now the fact that you don't have to do your commercial training in them changes the equation a little bit, because training has always driven the hours in the fleet at every level. Guess I ranted a little bit there. Sorry.
Well, it's going on 10 o'clock, George.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate this. It's really helpful to me. And I hope it tells us all that the club lives on. We have stood down for a little while, but I hope we all keep thinking about flying. And if you look at the Learning Center, keep an eye on that. Jay is going to do another session on check rides, and Heinz is going to do a session on flying gliders. I'm looking forward to that. And I know for a fact I'm working with some of the other instructors on some ideas they have. And I would love to keep gathering here on Thursday nights to talk about one thing or another having to do with the club. And if anybody wants to hang around for another 5 minutes and tell me what their favorite airplane is, I would love to listen. We've talked about the hard facts of trying to put a fleet together, but we all, you know, have a right to our dreams. And maybe next week we can talk about club financials. Michael and Graham went around a little bit at the last board meeting about the concept of retained earnings, as I recall. So get your tickets early. That'll be a barn burner.
I'm going to put my vote in for John's TBM 850.
Yeah.
We had a club member who owned one of those one time. Unfortunately, he crashed it, but that was after we threw him out of the club.
Right.
That's a sad story. I shouldn't even joke about it.
Yeah.
Who else has got a favorite airplane?
Aero Commander 50, AC-50.
Aero Commander.
I hear it every night flying over my house. I think LabCorp flies one of those.
Really?
Yep.
That's the high wing retractable, right?
High wing, multi-engine retractable.
Yeah, and they haven't built them in what, 30, 40 years?
Yeah, that was Bob Hoover's airplane.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is an elegant airplane in its own funny way.
I want to go the other way down the scale. I like it. I like air coupes.
Air coupes.
Yeah.
The rudderless airplane.
Yep. Yeah, they're a lot of fun. I flew one, I flew one, you open up the canopy, put your arm out and fly low and slow.
Well, that's why I have a Cub. Low, slow, and bright yellow. What's the airplane standing behind you there, Mike?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that is actually I think it's a Beach 18 on a stick at a miniature golf course in Myrtle Beach.
I love that. I love that. Beach 18 is a pretty airplane too.
Oh, I agree.
It really is. I always said if I won the lottery, I'd buy a DC-3 and put all my friends in it and fly to Oshkosh.
Yeah,
but I could
saw
probably
that
do
and
it.
said we had to golf there because it's got an airplane.
That's fantastic.
The only Cessna that I have ever even thought about would be a Cessna 195.
Yeah.
Just absolutely beautiful airplane, and the standard at the time for private air travel.
Yep.
John, didn't somebody kill themselves in a 195 at Horace Williams some years back?
Yeah, they did. I've flown a 195 up to Oshkosh and back. It's a wonderful airplane.
Yeah.
I agree.
What does one go for these days, Grover?
I don't know for sure, but I would guess in the $200,000 to $300,000 range.
Yeah.
You could buy a nice 421 for that.
There are a lot of planes
Nice
you could
overhaul
buy.
on that round engine too.
Yeah.
Round engines are awesome. I love to listen to them, but I would not want to maintain one.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've got a pretty cool airplane behind you there, Grover.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, it got washed today.
Well,
Yeah.
I realize that's just a picture you're sitting in front of, but
Yeah, but that's where I was today. I went out at the airport and the wash pit was open, so I washed it. Got the yellow off.
and where does it live now?
RDU.
At Raleigh still? Okay.
Yeah.
Where was that picture taken?
Let's see. Oh, that was the day we bought it, and Ronnie was in the front seat there, getting ready to take off on the initial check flight of the plane up in Wisconsin.
Oh, okay.
We bought it January 1, 2015, and he and Lynn and I flew up there in the Diamond. Ronnie did the test flying on it. I had just recently gotten my tailwheel endorsement. So Ronnie and I flew it back, and Lynn flew the Diamond back, and we kind of tag teamed along the way there. But,
I talked to Ronnie the other day. He called me just yesterday, I think. He's doing okay. He's still flying, but small loads.
Yep.
So who did your tailwheel endorsement?
Zinda Lease had a fellow,
Oh,
forgot
yeah.
his name now, did it in a 170B.
Yeah. I
They're
remember.
at Sanford, actually.
Yeah.
He brought Zinda's plane over, and I did my tailwheel endorsement with him, and it was good.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've thought about doing, once I get my CFI, maybe doing some spin endorsements, stuff like that with the plane, but I don't think I would ever want to do tailwheel instruction in it, because it's new tailwheel students tend to be kind of hard on the airplanes. Yeah.
Tell me about it. I got the Cub to do tailwheel instruction, but it's so pretty. I'm scared to fly it half the time.
Yeah.
I just like a beat up old Citabria for that job.
Yeah.
But
hey, if anybody's interested, I've got to fly my decathlon down to Pitt Greenville before the end of the month, drop it off for annual, and I need a ride back from Pitt Greenville. So I'm shamelessly plugging myself. So I need a ride back from Pitt Greenville to RDU if anybody's available.
who's going to do the annual down at Pitt Greenville?
Stuart Dillon Aviation.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, I know you have a relationship with him.
Yeah, I've been very happy with him. He's done a good job so far, last few years.
The whole issue of general aviation maintenance is a whole other topic.
Yeah.
But we are just very lucky to have Ryan. At the board meeting the other night, he reported on maintenance and said again that he loves the club because of the way we take care of each other, and wants to raise his kids here, and makes me happy every time I hear that. I do not want to go through trying to find another maintenance director anytime soon. And we would never find somebody like him. He's really very special. And you can quote me on that. Anybody else left who's got a favorite airplane?
I think you already said it, but the Cub.
The Cub. Who is saying Cub?
Your daughter.
Oh.
I recognize that voice. You didn't, George?
There were several voices there. Well,
Yeah.
Kate, if we can ever work things out with your mother, you can learn to fly in the Cub. That was the other reason I decided to go find the Cub. I wanted you and your brother to learn to fly in it.
I want to learn to fly in it.
Yeah, well,
It's awesome.
we have a quorum, but we don't have a consensus in the family.
I mean, to be fair, it won't be that long until we're in college, and then we don't need parental approval. So.
Don't you always have to have parental approval?
Not necessarily.
Kate, we don't need to air out our family difficulties here on this forum.
We really don't.
No.
I would just say the Cub's great. Low, slow, bright yellow.
It's a beautiful thing. It really is. You talk about in the air coupe, you talk about flying along with your arm hanging out the window. With a Cub, you lower the door, open the window, and you're out there in the breeze. It's a beautiful thing.
Oh, yeah.
You ever thought about doing the clown routine in that airplane, George?
I do it every day, John. You just need to be around more.
That's, all these people naming their most favorite airplane or dream airplane. I'm listening to everyone, and I can't make a distinguish between anyone that's been offered so far. I agree.
Sure. Yeah. Nobody's named an airplane yet that I wouldn't love to fly.
I got to do other things this evening, so
sure.
Thank you all, and I'm going to absent myself, and we'll see you next week.
You bet, John.
All right. Bye-bye.
I see the blinds are on. I'm just curious, have you guys had any regrets for selling the club for Foxtrot?
Brian Tesser? Brian Grant? Unmute your mic and talk to us.
We're working to find that button there.
Yeah, I know. I could have jumped in there and helped you.
No, we have no regrets whatsoever. I mean, it was really of course, a very hard decision selling one's first airplane. But, you know, we really appreciate the club. That's where I learned to fly. And it was a great opportunity for, you know, other folks to enjoy the plane we had. So great decision, I think, all around.
And you can come back and fly it if you get lonely.
Absolutely.
It's given 64 Tango Zulu a run for its money.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the best thing ever, when you can sell your airplane to a friend who will let you come and fly it anytime you want. That's the best deal ever.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, and I think, George, the other big part about the club, you know, we would never consider buying a Mooney ourselves if that wasn't an option as part of the club. And absolutely, that's been the right decision for us. A lot of utility, a lot of new skills, and it's a great flying airplane.
I get calls more often than you would imagine from people who say, I'm calling from Kansas and I'm getting ready to buy a Mooney. I'm looking for someone who can teach me how to fly a Mooney. It's not that easy to find someone with that kind of experience. And we have experience flying them and maintaining them. And sometimes it works out, often it doesn't, because, you know, the club is just not set up to take somebody flying for 4 or 5 hours. You know, I often say, when people ask me, why should I learn to fly at the club, or why should I fly there? You can not only learn how to fly, but you can learn how to own an airplane. You can learn how to maintain an airplane. You can learn how to be a part of the aviation community, which is not something you get at a flight school. And that's what worked for you guys. I used to always say that you were the smartest airplane owners I knew, because there's this thing, we remember the Peter principle in business, where we all rise to our level of incompetence. In aircraft ownership, we all rise to our level of unaffordability. You know, if we can afford a 152, we buy a 182. If we can afford a 182, you know, you guys went out and bought an airplane you could afford, and afford to maintain properly, and afford to equip the way you wanted it, turned it into a beautiful airplane and flew the heck out of it, and learned how to own an airplane, and learned how to live with an airplane and maintain an airplane. And so many of us go out and buy an airplane that we can't afford to maintain the way it should be afforded. There's a twin Comanche sitting on the ramp down at Sanford now, which desperately needs a paint job, and its owner can't afford to paint it, so it sits there looking like hell. You guys really went about it, I thought, in a very wise way, and you know, that's allowed you to step up to the next thing.
Yeah, we appreciate that, George.
Yeah, I use you guys as an example often of the mistakes that we make in airplane ownership, and the wisest way to go about owning an airplane. And it's really been a lot of fun watching you guys grow into airplane ownership and get all the pleasure and the joy out of it, and travel in it. It's really nice. I often say there are many good reasons to own an airplane. Saving money is not one of them, but you can do it more or less wisely. And you know, a perfect example of not a great way would be buying a Cirrus that you can't afford to stay current in. I'm not talking about Ken. I mean, they maintain their airplane beautifully and use it a lot, and can afford to take care of it. But I've watched people get into airplanes they can't afford to take care of properly, and it's just never works out. It's sad to see. I meant to say earlier, we've talked Ken into instructing at the club, which is going to be really pretty great. And that's one of the things I'm really looking forward to when we start flying again. Ken's been a past president of the club and a steadfast member. And even though he has his own airplane and flies other airplanes, he has taken care of the club and done some of the really thankless jobs like running the election committee and, shows up at board meetings and keeps the flight data, which we never had before. Back in the 90s when I was president, people would always say, well, how can you make any decisions when you don't have the data? And part of it has been my FBO, but he has kept all that data and analyzed it. And every month it says, good month, bad month, best month. And it's been hugely helpful. Now we have the data to make some of those decisions. So I want a Howard 500. That's my favorite airplane right now. And I bet I can find one. I bet you guys don't even know what one looks like. I was at Oshkosh 2 or 3 years ago and walked past, many of you have heard this story, but walked past, oh yeah. They're all so beautiful. Come on. There we go. And walked past 2 beautiful twins, piston twins with a drooping belly and beautiful lines. And I had never, on my screen, my picture of all the people are kind of blocking it, but those are all Howard 500s. So you can see this one with a swooping belly that kind of sits on the grass, and it's sort of a mid-wing. Some of them, I think, have turbine engines. These are obviously turbine engines. I'd never seen one before, and it had that beautiful retro look, and I didn't know what it was, and there was no information sitting next to them. They were in a big cluster of airplanes, so walking down the flight line, getting ready for the show one day. And Serena was walking with me, and we looked at it. Neither one of us knew what it was. So she went to her 5,000 Twitter followers and said, somebody tell me what this airplane is, and got 5,000 different answers. And the next morning at breakfast, we're sitting there with John, and I asked her, what information did you get from all your Twitter followers? And she said, well, somebody said it was this, somebody said it was that. And she took out her phone and was looking at the picture of it, and John leaned over and said, oh, that's the Howard 500. That was built by so-and-so in 1954, and it was supposed to be the next business corporate aircraft, but it came along just about the time jets were taking over. So they re-engined it with the turbine engines made by so-and-so, and that was successful, prolonged its life for a little while, but it quickly became an anachronism almost before it was built, and so there were only 423 of them built, or 200, whatever. John just gave us a whole dissertation on it, and I thought, that's the generational thing. That's the difference between depending on your Twitter followers to tell you what's up and just knowing everything about every damn airplane ever made. But now I want to get a Howard 500 to take all my friends to Oshkosh with. It's smaller than a DC-3, but I got not that many friends, so. Well, I think Graham went to eat dinner, but
No, I'm back.
oh, you're back. Well, I think next Thursday we should have you and Michael talk about retained earnings.
Yeah, I mean that would burn some time.
I thought we said we were going to do it on like the 28th.
Yeah.
When we have a board check-in. But hey, we could do it twice.
That's true.
if the
No,
people demand it.
I'm obviously kidding a little bit, but Graham, you and I have been talking for a long time about you getting me caught up on understanding some of the wrinkles in our accounting system.
Yeah, and when we first started talking about that, I actually was up to speed and remembered most of it.
Well, Michael has obviously been digging into it lately, so he can spool us all up. Seriously, I think it'd be a useful thing. Not many people probably are going to want to dig into it that deeply, but I need to understand it better. Every now and then I think I do, but so I don't know. We'll think of something worth talking about. Any
We were talking about favorite airplanes. I wouldn't call it a favorite, particularly since I've never been in one, but I've always kind of had an interest in the 337, the Cessna Skymaster.
Oh, yeah. You'd go work for MAG and fly one.
Yeah.
The Mixmaster, finally.
Yeah, that's what they call it.
And you can get a multi-rating with a center line thrust restriction. So, because you don't have the adverse yaw if you lose an engine.
Yeah.
I had a friend who instructed me F-15 down at Seymour, and he had a centerline thrust restriction on his multi-rating because on the F-15, the engines were close enough to the fuselage so that the FAA decided there was not that much adverse thrust. There was a whole lot of thrust, but all right. Well, that's a pretty cool airplane. I've never flown one either. They're noisy as hell, and they had a lot of trouble keeping the rear engine cool over time. But it's a unique design, and I do have another favorite airplane that I gotta find an image of it here.
Recently, there was a company that took a 337 and took the rear engine and converted it to electric, so that it's got a piston engine in the front and an electric motor in the back, just as an experimental vehicle.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean, they're still out there as workhorses. There's a reason why MAG flies them, a bunch of them. Not sure what that reason is, but there is one. Here we go. When I was doing the children's play for all those years, I was always after Holly to get me a Piaggio Avanti. That would be my favorite airplane.
So it has PT6s in it that are the right way around?
I'd have to go back and refresh myself as to which engine that is. It's a pusher turboprop. It's a 400 knot turboprop. It is a canard wing. I'm not sure if it's a true canard or not. I'd have to go back and look that up. And it's incredibly fast. And it just looks so cool.
It looks like the elevator's on the T-tail, just from the picture there.
It's got a canard and a T-tail.
Yeah, it does have the T-tail, and then it's got I don't know if that's a true canard wing or not. I don't think it's an elevator. I think it's just a canard.
Right, right.
And
what do you mean by a true canard?
Well, true canard is not does not work as the elevator. It's not a control surface. It's a surface.
Okay.
It's just designed to have a different angle of attack, so that it will stall before. It's a lifting surface, in other words, and it's designed so that it will stall because it's at a higher angle of attack than the wing, so that it makes the airplane almost stall proof because the canard will quit flying, it will pitch down, reduce the angle of attack on the main wing, and keep flying.
Yeah.
But there are airplanes that have essentially an elevator on the front that is a control surface.
The Velocity has that set up.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a velocity authority here. And you'll see 182s with there's a Peterson conversion that puts a control surface on the front like that of a 182. And it still has the conventional elevator. And you can land it at I had a guy that I would do an annual for or a flight review for periodically, and he had one, and you could land it truly at 35 knots, a 182. But I mean, Piaggio Avanti. It's just cool to say it.
So George, this is Brian Grant. We were at Sun and Fun a few years ago, and we saw one of these aircraft do a flyby down the flight line there at the air show, and it was absolutely a rocket ship. Really impressive airplane.
It is. It's just a brilliant design, and it is beautiful, and it looks really cool, and well, I shouldn't say that, but I mean, and it's got a beautiful flight deck. I mean, not a great picture, but fabulous flight deck. Great visibility because you don't have props out there in the way. I'm trying to look for some specs on it.
Well, George, you'll have to have the fleet committee maybe work up a pros and cons on a Piaggio then.
Yeah, I don't see any cons.
Yeah.
It's got to be about the specs. I may have exaggerated a little bit here, but 79 people wingspan. Here we go. And I never understood why it didn't catch on more than it has. It's expensive, but here we go. Performance, 400 knots. I wasn't kidding. 460 miles an hour, 400 knots. Cruising at 318. Minimum control speed, 100 knots. The minimum control speed of my twin Comanche is 90 knots. So what this is telling you is that you can actually fly this on one engine as slow as 100 knots. That's unbelievable. Range, 1,500 nautical miles, which is not bad for a twin like this. Ferry range.
Is that a turboprop or just a piston engine? I mean, it's got a service.
It's a turboprop.
Turboprop.
Yeah. I don't know what engine is in it. It probably says so here. Takes off in 3,200 feet. I mean, it's just service ceiling 41,000 feet.
That's crazy. More than a CRJ.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. There are not many airplanes that can get up to that altitude.
The other plane that's kind of similar to that, George, that I always loved to see when it was flying was the Beech Starship.
Yeah.
It was a gorgeous airplane. There was actually one based at RDU for a lot of years. I think Burns owned it.
You know, Beechcraft collected them all, as you know, and crushed them.
Yeah.
And because there was an ongoing argument between the designer and Bert Rutan and Beechcraft, because the performance was not what Beechcraft had been led to believe it would be. And he claimed it was because they didn't trust its design and beefed it up unnecessarily and added weight to it. And they said it was because we didn't trust your design and had to beef it up and add weight to it. And so it never got too popular, but there's still a type club of about 4 or 5 people who own them and fly them.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
But the performance of the Piaggio,
It's the same engines. The Starship and the Piaggio both have PT6s, which are the same engine as in a King Air, but the way the engine is organized, if it's a normal tractor configuration, you wind up with the exhaust in the front and the intake in the back.
That's how you can,
for ease of maintenance, it's 2 independent sections that have no mechanical connection to each other, one that generates the hot gas and the other one that spins the prop. And the one that spins the prop is in the back. So it actually kind of makes sense to set one of these up as a pusher configuration like this.
It does. That's how you can tell a PT6 from a lot of the other turbine engines, because, as you say, it's sort of backwards. And also the PT6, you see turboprops sitting on a ramp, and they will just drift in the wind, just slowly rotate, unless sometimes people will strap them down. You'll see them with like a condom on each 2 of the blades, and, secured so that they don't drift around like that. But that's because they're completely separate from the combustion part of the engine. So they just freewheel. Whereas the Garrett engines that you see on some King Airs are kind of straight flow through, very efficient for that reason. But the props do not rotate on those. And when you park them, you'll see the pilots get out and turn the props on those so they don't take a set as they cool down. And the Garretts are very efficient and unbelievably noisy. I don't know if you can see me, but they call this the Garrett salute. Anyway, okay, so that's, I got to revisit the Piaggio. Be Still My Heart, actually. Some of you remember Jim Bauer when my son was about 8. We went down and spent a weekend on the Yorktown. It's the Yorktown, the one that's moored, sunk in the mud off Charleston, where you can go down there and visit. And up on the flight deck, they've got a bunch of airplanes of that vintage and later. And there was an F4 up there on the flight deck, and I took a picture of my son standing in front of it. And I sent it to Jim Bauer, and he texted me right back, and his only words were, "Be still, my heart." He had 150 missions in F4s off carriers in Vietnam, missile ships.
I wonder if that was the one he actually flew.
I don't know. That would be interesting. I never asked. He sometimes late at night, after everybody else was gone, I could get him to tell stories about those days. He was always the butt of the joke, but at the service they had for him at St. Thomas More there in Chapel Hill, where he spent a lot of time. Whenever I would get Jim and Dick Kenny together for dinner or something, I'd get them, the two of them, talking about the Catholic Church or the Navy, two institutions about which they were both deeply ambivalent. And then I'd just sit back and order another glass of wine and enjoy the show, because they both had that Irish sense of humor and were great storytellers. But at the service for him here at Chapel Hill, two of his squadron mates who had not seen him in, God knows, 30 or 40 years. You all know, of course, that Jim flew with the Blue Angels. He was sort of a standby pilot with the Blue Angels after his Vietnam years. But two of his squadron mates came all the way from California, and after the service, they both came up to me and said, I would not be alive today if it were not for Jim. You know, we just saw him as this kind of fat, affable guy who just kind of hung around and listened to all us tell our stories like they were just damn near most interesting thing since Chuck Gaither and both these guys just came up to me and said, you know, we know Jim's life didn't turn out all that well after all these years, but we just want people to know that you know, he was a real pilot, and they said it with that kind of affection. Anyway, but he could tell some funny stories. And you know, pilots of that era regard the F-4 as the last real airplane. It was the last, you know, airplane that you did not fly by wire. Basically just huge engine with airplane hooked on top of it. Anyway, all right, I'm getting sentimental now. Time to go home.
Yeah, I got to go, so I'm going to see you guys.
Ken, thanks so much. And
Enjoyed it, guys. Let's do it again soon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was fun. Thanks.
I'm going to try for next Thursday.
All right.
All right, see all you guys.
Appreciate it, George. Thanks for everybody.
Yeah, it's fun. I love you guys. Take care.
See ya.
Have a good night.
Good night. Good to see you.